The blip appeared on the screen at 0314 hours, and the young Soviet operator did not like it one bit. He was sitting in a windowless concrete bunker on the Baltic coast, somewhere south of Kaliningrad, in the small dead hours when the mind plays tricks and the radar hum becomes a kind of lullaby. He had been trained to recognize everything the West could throw at him. The fat, deliberate signature of an American B-52. The needle, quick dart of a reconnaissance Canberra. The cluttered return of a formation flying tight. He knew them all by heart, the way a birdwatcher knows wings. This was none of them. It came in high, very high, and it came in alone. On his scope it bloomed and then, impossibly, seemed to fold in on itself, the return shrinking when by every law of physics it should have grown as the aircraft drew nearer. It banked, and for a heartbeat it vanished altogether, swallowed by its own geometry. Then it was back, ghosting along the edge of Soviet airspace, neither entering nor leaving, simply watching. The operator did what frightened men in bunkers do. He called his supervisor. And somewhere in the chain of reports that climbed up through the air defense districts of the Western Military District that night, a phrase attached itself to the contact. Not a NATO code name, not a serial number. Something older, more superstitious, the kind of name soldiers give to things that unsettle them in the dark. The Black Bat. That, at least, is the story. And like so much from the Shadow War over the Baltic, it is a story stitched together from intercepts, defectors' tales, and the long memories of men who flew the aircraft that earned the name. What is not in doubt is the machine itself. Because the aeroplane casting that strange folding shadow across Soviet screens was the most extraordinary bomber Britain ever built, and quite possibly the most beautiful weapon of war ever to leave a British factory. A great white delta. A wing shaped like a manta ray or a stingray, or, yes, a bat with its wings half furled. An aircraft that could climb to 50,000 feet, outrun the fighters sent to catch it, and carry inside its belly a weapon capable of erasing a Soviet city from the map. The Avro Vulcan, the spearhead of Britain's independent nuclear deterrent. The aircraft Whitehall built so that, if the worst ever came, Britain would not have to ask Washington's permission to strike back. And in the late 1950s and through the 1960s, crews of that aircraft did something audacious. They flew towards the Soviet Union, again and again, not to attack, not yet, but to probe, to test the reflexes of Soviet air defense, to map the radar coverage, to make the men in those Baltic bunkers reach for their telephones in the small hours and report a shape they could not name. It was a peculiarly British piece of brinkmanship, quiet, deniable, conducted under the polite fiction of training and navigation exercises, but understood by everyone involved for exactly what it was. A message delivered at 500 knots that said, "We can reach you." How did a bankrupt, exhausted island, stripped of its empire and dependent on American loans, come to build an aircraft that haunted the dreams of Soviet radar crews? And what happened on those black Baltic nights that Whitehall would never quite admit to? That is the story. And it begins, as so many British stories do, with a bomb the country could barely afford, and an alliance it did not entirely trust. To understand the Vulcan, you have to understand the state Britain was in when she conceived it. And it was not a happy one. The war had been won. That was the official version, and it was true, but victory had hollowed the country out. By 1945, Britain was the world's largest debtor nation. The cities were scarred, the treasury was empty, and the great machinery of empire that had underwritten British power for 2 centuries was beginning, audibly, to crack. India would be gone by 1947. The dollar loans negotiated by John Maynard Keynes came with terms that humiliated a nation that had stood alone in 1940. Bread was rationed after the war, something it had never been during it. The lights, quite literally, kept going out. And into this exhausted, shivering, austerity-bound Britain came two pieces of devastating news from across the Atlantic. The first was the bomb. In August 1945, the Americans incinerated Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and in doing so, changed the arithmetic of national survival forever. Whitehall had been a full partner in the early atomic research. The tube alloys program, the British scientists who had crossed to work at Los Alamos. Britain had helped to build the thing. And then came the second blow. In 1946, the United States Congress passed the McMahon Act, slamming the door on atomic cooperation with everyone, allies included. Overnight, the British were locked out of the very weapon they had helped invent. The reaction in Whitehall was cold fury, and it crystallized in one of the most consequential decisions of the post-war era. In a secret cabinet committee meeting in 1947, the Foreign Secretary, Ernest Bevin, a bear of a man, a former trade unionist with no patience for being patronized, arrived late, having dozed off, and delivered a verdict that settled the matter. Britain would build her own bomb. "We've got to have this thing over here, whatever it costs," he growled. And then the line that has echoed down the decades, "We've got to have the bloody Union Jack on top of it." That was the political will. But a bomb is useless without a means of delivery, and here Britain faced a brutal technical reality. A nuclear weapon dropped on the Soviet Union would have to be carried there across thousands of miles of hostile airspace past the most heavily defended frontier on Earth. The Soviets were pouring resources into air defense, radar, interceptors, surface-to-air missiles. Any bomber sent against them would have to fly higher, faster, and further than anything that had existed in the late war. The Air Ministry issued the requirement in 1947. Specification B.35/46. It asked, in the dry language of Whitehall, for a jet bomber capable of carrying a 10,000-pound bomb to a target 1,500 nautical miles away, cruising at 500 knots at 50,000 feet. In 1947, this was close to science fiction. The jet engine was barely a decade old. No one had built a large aircraft that could do anything like this. 3 firms answered the call, and from their drawing boards would come the 3 aircraft that became the V-force, the Vickers Valiant, the Handley Page Victor, and the most radical of them all, the design from A.V. Rowe and Company of Manchester, Avro, the firm that had given Bomber Command the Lancaster. Their answer to the impossible specification was a shape no one had ever flown at that size. A pure delta wing, a flying triangle. The men in Whitehall who saw the first drawings did not quite believe it would work. It would. And it would carry Britain's deterrent for a generation. The man who drew the impossible was Roy Chadwick, Avro's chief designer, the genius behind the Lancaster, the aircraft that had flattened the Ruhr. Chadwick understood that the old way of building bombers was finished. You could not simply bolt jet engines onto a conventional fuselage and wings and expect to reach 50,000 feet at the speed of sound's edge. The drag would kill you. The structure would tear itself apart. The answer lay in a shape that nature and German wartime research had pointed towards: the delta. A single, great triangular wing, blending lift and structure and fuel tankage into one clean form. It was elegant, it was efficient at high altitude, and at the size, Avro proposed it was utterly unprecedented. Tragically, Chadwick would not live to see it fly. He was killed in 1947 when an Avro Tudor airliner crashed on takeoff. The controls fatally cross-wired during maintenance. The Vulcan would be completed by his successors, chief among them Stuart Davies, but the soul of the aircraft was Chadwick's. To prove the Delta would behave, Avro built a series of 1/3 scale research aircraft, the little Avro 707s, which flitted around the test ranges like the offspring of the great machine to come. And on August 30th, 1952, at Woodford in Cheshire, the prototype Vulcan itself lifted into the Lancashire sky for the first time, flown by Avro's chief test pilot, Rowley Falk. Falk, a dapper man who flew in a pinstripe suit, would later roll the great bomber at the Farnborough Air Show, a 4-engined strategic bomber, performing aerobatics like a fighter to the astonishment and delight of the watching crowds and the quiet horror of the Air Ministry. But behind the showmanship lay deadly strategic purpose. By the early 1950s, the Cold War had turned bitterly cold indeed. The Soviets had tested their own atomic bomb in 1949, years ahead of Western predictions. China had fallen to Mao. The Korean War had erupted, and for a terrifying moment it seemed it might escalate into the general conflict everyone feared. The Iron Curtain had descended exactly as Churchill had warned at Fulton, Missouri, in 1946, and behind it, the Red Army sat in strength that dwarfed anything NATO could field on the ground. For Britain, the logic was inescapable. The country could never match the Soviet Union man for man, tank for tank. Her only hope of deterring a Soviet attack on Western Europe, and her only hope of remaining a power that Washington and Moscow had to take seriously, lay in the threat of nuclear retaliation. The V-force was that threat made metal. The Royal Air Force built its plans around it with chilling precision. The bombers would be dispersed across airfields the length and breadth of Britain, so that no single Soviet strike could destroy them on the ground. They would be held at readiness, eventually at quick reaction alert, fueled and armed, crews waiting in caravans beside the runway, capable of getting airborne in under 4 minutes. 4 minutes. That was the margin between peace and the end of the world, and the crews who would fly them were the cream of the Royal Air Force. 5 men to a Vulcan, 2 pilots seated up front beneath the great fighter-style canopy, and behind them, in a windowless compartment facing backwards, 3 rear crew, the 2 navigators and the air electronics officer, the men who would find the target in the dark and defeat the defenses. They trained relentlessly. And as the 1950s wore on, and the bombs in their bays grew from kiloton fission weapons to genuine megaton hydrogen bombs, the question that hung over the whole enterprise sharpened to a single point. Could they actually get through? Could the Vulcan, for all its altitude and speed, really penetrate the gathering wall of Soviet air defense? There was only one way to find out. You had to go and look. The probing began quietly, as these things do, under cover of the routine. On the surface, RAF Bomber Command flew endless training sorties, navigation exercises, simulated bombing runs, exercises with names like Mickey Finn and Kinsman that scrambled the entire V-force from a standing start to test how quickly Britain could get her deterrent into the air. To the public, to the press, even to most of the men in uniform, this was simply the grinding routine of Cold War readiness. But some of those flights went further than the public ever knew. They flew north and east, out over the North Sea, up around Norway, and into the cold, grey skies above the Baltic, towards the very edge of the Warsaw Pact's air defences. And there, at the frontier, where international airspace shaded into Soviet sensitivity, they did something deliberately provocative. They lingered. they turned. They flew profiles designed to light up Soviet radar and trigger a response, so that the listening aircraft and the intelligence services could measure exactly how the bear reacted when something came prowling at the edge of its den. This was the dangerous, deniable end of the Cold War, the war of electrons and reflexes that never made the newspapers. The Vulcans did not cross the line, or not by much, and not in ways anyone would admit. But they went close enough to matter. Close enough that Soviet radar crews in their Baltic bunkers learned to dread the high, lone, folding contact that came in the small hours. What made the Vulcans so unsettling on those screens was not magic. It was that delta wing. The aircraft's enormous flat planform, when viewed from certain angles, presented a radar cross-section that behaved in strange and unhelpful ways for the men trying to track it. As the great bomber banked and turned, its signature could swell, shrink, and momentarily collapse, the smooth, blended surfaces scattering radar energy in directions that confounded the relatively crude Soviet sets of the period. An aircraft that big simply should not have been able to play hide-and-seek on a radar scope. The Vulcan could. Not deliberately. True stealth lay decades in the future, but as a happy accident of that beautiful, freakish shape. And there was the altitude. Early in its career, the Vulcan cruised so high that many Soviet interceptors of the day, the early MiGs, simply could not climb fast enough to reach it before it had done its business and turned for home. To the men on the ground, it must have seemed maddening. A target you could see on the scope, sometimes, when it chose to let you, and could do absolutely nothing about. The intelligence value of these flights was immense, and it flowed into a system that pooled British and American findings under the closest secrecy. Every probe taught the analysts something. Where the radar coverage was thick and where it was thin. How long the Soviets took to scramble. Which frequencies they used. The slow accumulation of knowledge that would, in the event of war, tell a Vulcan crew where the gaps in the wall might be. But the Soviets were not standing still. And here the story darkens. Because while the Vulcan crews probed and the analysts pored over their findings, Moscow was building the thing that would change everything. Not a faster fighter, a missile. A surface-to-air missile that could reach up to the heights the V-force depended on and pluck a bomber out of the sky. The first sign that the high-altitude sanctuary was a fiction came not over the Baltic, but over Sverdlovsk, in the heart of the Soviet Union, on the 1st of May 1960. And the aircraft that fell from the sky that day was not British. It was an American aircraft, a Lockheed U-2, flying a CIA reconnaissance mission at the very edge of space, 70,000 feet, higher even than the Vulcan could reach. Its pilot was Francis Gary Powers. And on May Day 1960, a Soviet SA-2 guideline missile climbed up out of the Urals and detonated near enough to bring him down. Powers survived, was captured, was paraded before the world's press in a propaganda coup that wrecked a superpower summit in Paris and humiliated President Eisenhower. In Whitehall, the implications landed like a hammer blow. If a Soviet missile could reach a U-2 at 70,000 feet, then the Vulcan's 50,000 feet was no sanctuary at all. It was a death sentence. The entire doctrine of the V-force, fly high, fly fast, fly above the defenses, had just been rendered obsolete by a single missile in the Urals. Everything the RAF had built its deterrent upon was, in the space of an afternoon, called into question. The response was a wholesale reinvention of how the deterrent would be flown. And it was one of the more remarkable adaptations in the history of the Royal Air Force. If the Vulcan could no longer go over the top of the defences, it would go underneath them. The crews abandoned the high-altitude profile they had trained for and learned instead to fly. low, very low. Down on the deck at 250 feet, hugging the contours of the land, using hills and valleys to mask the aircraft from radar until the last possible moment. It transformed the experience of flying the great bomber. At 50,000 feet, the Vulcan had been serene, a white delta cruising in the silent blue. Down low, it became a beast, bucking and hammering through the turbulence, the airframe groaning, the crew thrown about in their seats, the ground a green blur ripping past beneath the wings. The aircraft was painted in disruptive camouflage now, the gleaming anti-flash white of the high-altitude era replaced by dark greens and greys, the better to hide against the earth. And the Baltic flights continued, transformed by this new doctrine. Now the Vulcans came in low across the sea, skimming the cold grey water, popping up only to be seen and then dropping away again. To the Soviet radar crews this was, if anything, more unnerving than before. The contact that had once ghosted high and remote now came in fast and low and aggressive, appearing from nowhere out of the sea clutter, lingering at the edge of detection, then gone. Picture one of those nights, a Vulcan from a Lincolnshire bomber base, refueled in the dark over the North Sea, running in towards the Baltic at low level. In the cockpit, the two pilots fly on instruments and nerve, the radio altimeter their lifeline. Behind them, in the black windowless cabin, the navigators bend over their screens, and the air electronics officer watches his equipment for the telltale flicker of a Soviet radar locking on, his hand near the controls that would jam it. The whole crew, tense, professional, utterly silent but for the crackle of the intercom. This was the work. Night after night, exercise after exercise, the V-force rehearsed the unthinkable, the flight they prayed they would never have to make, the one-way run into the Soviet heartland that would mean the world was ending. And the Soviet crews watched their black bat come and go, and learned to fear the shape that would not behave on their screens. But fear, in the Cold War, was the entire point. The cost of this enterprise was paid in several currencies, and not all of them were obvious. There was, first, the cost in blood, quiet, unglamorous, and largely forgotten. Flying a 60-ton Delta bomber at 250 feet, by night, in all weathers, is one of the most demanding things an Air Force can ask of its crews, and it killed men. Vulcans were lost over the years to accidents, to the brutal stresses of low-level flight, to the simple unforgiving margin for error that exists when you fly that big and that low and that fast. These were not combat losses. There was no war. But the men who died rehearsing for the war that never came died just as surely as if there had been one. And they are not much remembered outside the squadrons and the families who lost them. There was the cost to the Treasury, which had agonized over the V-force from the beginning. Britain, never rich in these post-war decades, poured a fortune into three separate types of bomber, into the bombs they carried, into the airfields and the dispersal sites, and the whole vast apparatus of nuclear readiness. Every pound spent on the deterrent was a pound not spent on the conventional forces, on the army on the Rhine, on the navy, on the social programs that a battered electorate demanded. The deterrent was the great devourer of the defense budget, and the arguments about whether it was worth it ran through Whitehall for the entire period and have never entirely stopped. And there was the cost to British independence, the most painful irony of the whole story. The V-force had been built so that Britain would never have to ask Washington's permission to defend herself. Bevin's bloody Union Jack on top of the bomb. But the strategic ground kept shifting. As Soviet defenses improved and the cost of staying ahead spiraled, Britain found that going it alone was becoming impossible. The bombers needed a standoff missile to launch their weapons from beyond the range of the defences, and the British attempt to build one, Blue Streak, then the air-launched Blue Steel, and its planned successor, ran into trouble. The reckoning came at Nassau, in the Bahamas, in December 1962, when Harold Macmillan met President Kennedy. The Americans had just cancelled the Skybolt missile that Britain had been counting on to extend the V-force's life, leaving Macmillan exposed and furious. What he negotiated in its place changed everything. The Americans would sell Britain the Polaris submarine-launched missile. The future of the British deterrent would move from the air to beneath the sea, from the RAF's bombers to the Royal Navy's submarines. It was a lifeline, and Macmillan seized it. But it came at a price that troubled many in Whitehall. Britain's independent deterrent would now depend, intimately and permanently, on American technology, American missiles, American goodwill. The very dependence the V-force had been built to escape had been written into the heart of the deterrent after all. The Union Jack was still on top of the bomb, but the missile underneath it would be made in America. What Britain learned, in the end, was the hard arithmetic of being a medium power in a superpower world. You could be brilliant, and the Vulcan was brilliant, an aircraft that punched far above the weight of the exhausted nation that built it. You could be brave, and the crews who flew those Baltic nights were as brave as any. But brilliance and bravery could not, in the end, buy you out of the central fact of the age, that true independence belonged only to the giants, and Britain was no longer a giant. The Vulcan would fly on, but its days as the spearhead were numbered. On the last day of June 1969, the Royal Navy took over the nuclear deterrent from the Royal Air Force, and the long reign of the V-force as Britain's nuclear spearhead came quietly to an end. It was a HMS Resolution, a Polaris submarine slipping silently beneath the waves, that now carried the Union Jack on top of the bomb. The logic was unanswerable. A submarine could not be caught on the ground by a surprise attack. It could hide in the vastness of the ocean, undetectable, ready to retaliate from anywhere. No improvement in Soviet air defense could touch it. The bomber, however magnificent, had been overtaken by the march of technology, just as the U-2's fall had warned it would be. But the Vulcan did not retire. Far from it. Stripped of the strategic nuclear role, the Great Delta found new work. It soldiered on in the tactical strike role assigned to NATO, still capable of carrying nuclear weapons against targets in the European theatre. It took on maritime reconnaissance, and the Baltic flights, the probing, the endless electronic fencing with Soviet air defense. That continued too, for the intelligence war did not stop simply because the deterrent had moved underwater. The knowledge gathered on those flights fed into something larger than Britain alone. Throughout this period, the British and the Americans shared signals and electronic intelligence in one of the closest and most secret partnerships of the Cold War, the foundation of what would become the Five Eyes Alliance. Every probe of Soviet defenses, every measurement of their radar and their reaction times went into a common pool of Western knowledge. Britain, diminished as a conventional power, remained a genuine heavyweight in the shadow world of intelligence. And the V-force's lonely Baltic flights were part of the coin she paid into that alliance to keep her seat at the table. For the men who had flown the deterrent, the change was bittersweet. They had held, for over a decade, the most awesome responsibility the country could place on a serviceman, the readiness, at 4 minutes' notice, to fly the mission that would mean the end of everything. They had lived with that, the QRA crews waiting by the runway, the dispersals, the drills, the cold knowledge of what they were for. And now that burden passed to a handful of submariners hidden beneath the sea, men whose patrols would never be seen and whose vigil would never be acknowledged. The Vulcan's strange afterlife, though, was not yet over, and it would furnish one of the most extraordinary episodes in RAF history. In 1982, when Argentina seized the Falkland Islands, the aging Vulcan was hauled out for one last extraordinary feat of arms. The Black Buck raids saw Vulcans fly from Ascension Island to bomb Port Stanley Airfield, at the time the longest-range bombing missions in the history of warfare, a staggering chain of air-to-air refueling that pushed the old aircraft and its crews to the absolute limit. The aircraft built to strike Moscow ended its operational career bombing a runway in the South Atlantic in defense of the last scattered remnants of empire. There was something fitting in that, something very British. But the deeper aftermath of the V-force years lay in what it had revealed about Britain's place in the world. The country had built, out of post-war wreckage, a genuinely world-class deterrent and a genuinely world-class aircraft. And it had then discovered the limits of what such achievements could buy. The special relationship had been confirmed as the indispensable axis of British security. Confirmed and revealed for what it was. A partnership, yes, but never quite a partnership of equals. Stand today on an airfield where a preserved Vulcan rests, and you will understand at once why the aircraft inspired the names it did. It is enormous. The delta wing stretches out like something prehistoric, a great white shadow that blots out the sky. When the last airworthy example, XH558, flew at air shows in the years before its final grounding in 2015, grown men wept at the sound of it. The unearthly howl those four engines made at certain power settings, a noise unlike any other aircraft on Earth. A sound that Soviet radar crews never heard, but that a generation of Britons did and never forgot. The Vulcan howl, they called it. People drove for hours and stood in rain-swept fields just to hear it one last time. That tells you something about what the Vulcan meant and means still. It was a weapon of unimaginable destructive purpose, built to carry the apocalypse into the heart of the Soviet Union. And yet, the country that built it came to love it, the way you can only love something that embodies a moment when you were better than you had any right to be. Post-war Britain was broke, shrinking, stripped of empire, dependent on American money and American goodwill. And out of that exhausted island came this. An aircraft so far ahead of its time that it confounded the radar of its enemies and still looks, half a century on, like something from the future. The Black Bat over the Baltic. Whether the Soviets truly called it that, or whether the name is one of those legends that gathers around remarkable machines, captures a real truth. For a brief and dangerous period, Britain reached out across the cold grey water and made the most powerful land empire on Earth flinch. It did so not with the vast resources of a superpower, but with brilliance, nerve, and a beautiful, freakish triangle of aluminium and ambition. And it tells us, in the end, something honest about Britain's role in the world during those years. A nation no longer able to stand among the giants, but determined nonetheless to be reckoned with. Too proud to be a client, too weak to be a peer, finding her place in the cracks between the superpowers, in the intelligence she gathered, the alliances she brokered, the technology she pioneered. The Vulcan was Britain in metal, diminished but undefeated, outclassed in size, never in skill. The men who flew those Baltic nights are mostly gone now, or very old. They flew towards the abyss again and again so that the rest of us could sleep. And they did it without recognition, without medals for a war that never came, asking nothing but to do the job well. We owe them the small courtesy of remembering. So that is the story of the Black Bat over the Baltic, The bankrupt island that built the most beautiful bomber in the world and flew it to the edge of the enemy's den to prove a point that needed proving. Now, I'd like to hear from you. Do you think the V-force genuinely deterred a Soviet attack? Or was it, as some historians argue, an expensive vanity that Britain could ill afford? And were the Baltic probing flights a stroke of strategic genius, or a reckless gamble that could have triggered the very war they were meant to prevent? Tell me in the comments below. If you enjoyed this, do give the video a like and subscribe for more stories from the shadow war that shaped modern Britain. Until next time.